So, what's a major cause of cancer? Mutations. Again, we've got spontaneous mutations and induced mutations. With spontaneous mutations, there's really nothing you can do about it. It's just a thing that happens. It's a cost of being alive. Induced mutations, though, these are things that aren't part of the normal process, which also means that they're to at least some extent avoidable. Agents that cause cancer are carcinogens. They generate cancer. And usually these are things that are mutagens. They cause mutations. Mutations in general, inducing mutations is a bad thing because you could turn on a proto-oncogene or turn off a tumor suppressor. What's the evidence for this? That cancer is, largely caused by carcinogens, not just happenstance or inheritance. Well, one thing is when people immigrate. If people move to a new country, their children and their grandchildren often have the same cancer occurrence, the same profile of what cancers they get, as people who live in their new country, not in their old country, meaning it's probably something about the environment, not something about the genes that they came with. And we can also do epidemiology. We can look at things that are in the environment, especially things that are suspected mutagens, and see, does exposure to this thing, like cigarette smoke or exhaust fumes, does this increase people's risk of getting cancers? But that just sort of gives us a hint. It points at a factor, but it doesn't prove it. How do we know that something's a carcinogen? A lot of times what we do are lab tests. You can take some sort of suspected carcinogen and you can put it on something like bacteria or yeast, single-celled organisms, and you can assess, is it a mutagen? Does it cause genetic changes in those bacteria or yeast? And this is kind of nice because this is something we can do cheaply, we can do easily, we can do quickly, and honestly, there's not a lot of ethical concerns because people kill bacteria and yeast all the time, all day, every day, and nobody bats an eye. But if we want to prove that something is a carcinogen, not just that it causes mutations, but that it causes cancer, what we usually do is look at what happens to mice or rats that are exposed to that chemical. Does their rate of cancer increase? If it does, we can say it's probably a carcinogen. Just as a side note, some of the stuff that has been shown to be carcinogens in rats and mice almost certainly is at the dose that it's tested at, but in order to make sure that they see the effect if it's present and not have to use too many rats or mice for the experiment, experimenters will often design these trials with fairly high doses of the suspected carcinogen. So you end up with rats or mice consuming the equivalent of 200 or 300 Diet Cokes a day, or something like that, which does tell you, okay, this thing is a cancer risk, but is that really realistic? Is it really enough of a cancer risk to someone who's drinking 2 or 3 Diet Cokes a day that they actually need to worry about it? Carcinogens aren't the only actor, though. Viruses can also potentially contribute to cancer. There's a group of viruses that are called latent viruses, and they'll actually insert their DNA into our DNA. Meaning that we'll get a chunk of virus DNA stuck in there with our own DNA. Why is that bad? Well, it could be that where that virus sticks its gene in is something like, I don't know, P53, a tumor suppressor. When that virus sticks its gene into our genome, and disrupts that p53, is that p53 going to make the same thing when it gets transcribed now that it's got this big chunk of virus in the middle? No, it will not. It has now broken that gene. It has now disrupted that tumor suppressor gene. So that tumor suppressor isn't working anymore. About 10% of cancers are linked to some sort of viral infection, generally of one of these latent viruses that sticks its DNA in where it isn't wanted and can potentially disrupt genes, causing issues. And you can inherit not a cancer, but a cancer risk. Probably one of the clearest examples of this is retinoblastoma. So take a second. You inherit how many copies of each tumor suppressor gene from your parents normally? Check in. How many copies? So I'm hoping you all loudly and clearly said 2, because we get 1 from mom, 1 from dad, same as all of our genes except for the sex-linked genes if you're XY. If one of the copies that you inherit is mutated, that renders you suddenly a lot more susceptible to cancer. So in this case of the retinoblastoma, normally someone has 2 copies of that retinoblastoma associated gene. So if you inactivate one of them, you're still not going to get retinoblastoma. You have to inactivate both of them before you're able to get cancer. But someone who has inherited retinoblastoma, they inherited 1 defective copy, 1 copy that was already screwed up. So they didn't have retinoblastoma from birth, but they only need to get that second hit before they get cancer. They don't need to hit this, to inactivate the same gene twice in the same cell. They've only got to inactivate it once. A more common inherited cancer risk gene is BRCA1. BRCA1 and BRCA2 are major risk factors for breast cancer. That's why it's BR for breast, CA for cancer. BRCA1 is a normal tumor suppressor gene. In your everyday life, it is there keeping your cells from dividing when they're not supposed to. If someone has 1 mutated BRCA1 gene, that is, one is screwy and the other one's okay, their chances of getting cancer, breast cancer specifically, by age 50 are somewhere in the 1 in 3 to 1 in 2 chance. They are highly likely to get breast cancer by the age of 70. The majority of women who inherit 1 defective BRCA1 gene are going to get breast cancer by the time they're 70. Whereas someone who has 2 normal copies of BRCA1 has a pretty low chance of getting breast cancer by the time that they're 50. And only a 10% overall lifetime risk if we say by 70. So this is a huge difference. And not only does this increase your risk of breast cancer, it also increases your risk of ovarian cancer. If you know that there's a history of breast cancer and ovarian cancer in your family, this is something that you really want to get checked out for, because it strongly influences the likelihood of you getting cancer. And if you get cancer, there is a chance that you may die. Even men, this might be something you'd want to get checked out with if there's a really strong history of cancer in your family. Because while it is rare for men to get breast cancer, they do have enough breast tissue to get breast cancer. And since they're not normally getting annual breast exams, it's actually likely to go later before it gets diagnosed. Okay, so how do you reduce your cancer risk? Because I admit, this topic can get pretty scary. Stats are that 1 in 3 people approximately will get cancer at some point over their life, but 50% or better of people who get cancer are going to survive it. And the stats are actually getting better all the time. So let's talk about reducing your cancer risk in treating your cancer. So, carcinogens. Carcinogens are present in the environment, but you can reduce or even eliminate your exposure to them. So, for example, Mormons in Utah. People who are strict Mormons are supposed to abstain entirely from alcohol and tobacco. And if you survey people who are strict Mormons, their cancer rates are 50% that of the rest of the country. Alcohol and tobacco are major carcinogens. They're major contributors to people's cancer risk. If you're smoking, reducing or quitting smoking as soon as you can does a huge amount to reduce your cancer risk very, very quickly. Within a few years, your cancer risk may be back to baseline. In fact, 30% of cancer deaths can be linked to tobacco. 30%. That one act, quitting smoking, can, over the course of a few years of not smoking, reduce your cancer risk by almost a third. Saturated fat and red meat are associated with certain cancers, and eating a wide variety of colorful fruits and vegetables seems to be associated with a certain amount of cancer protection. Obesity, there's also some cancer risk there. Some of it may be the obesity itself. Some of it may be that doctors don't tend to treat people with obesity as well, and so the cancers take longer to get diagnosed potentially, or are getting misdiagnosed. If you quit smoking, reduce your red meat consumption, get more fruits and veggies, and exercise, you can do a huge amount to reduce your cancer risk. Will you reduce it to zero? Absolutely not. There is no one thing that completely protects you from cancer, but you can reduce your risk with some fairly straightforward, if not necessarily easy, but fairly straightforward lifestyle changes. You can also reduce your risk by reducing your exposure to human papillomavirus. This is one of those viruses that is associated with cancer, and you can get vaccinated against it. Cells that have been infected with the human papillomavirus, electron micrograph, shown up here, have a strong tendency to divide abnormally. Because, again, of that probability of HPV disrupting their DNA. And so, if you get vaccinated against the human papillomavirus, you're going to reduce your risk of developing those particular cancers. And at the moment, there's at least 200 million Americans infected with HPV. So getting that vaccine is a good protective. A huge chunk of the people who are currently infected with HPV are actually young adults. This is something that's sexually transmitted, so it's fairly frequent for people to acquire it at some point in their teens and 20s. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of strains of human papillomavirus. A lot of them are only associated with skin warts, but a number of them are associated with cancer, and there's 2 of them that are responsible for a huge fraction of the cases of cervical cancer and throat cancer that are found every year. The vaccine called Cervarix is specifically against HPV 16 and 18. Those are responsible for 70% of cervical cancers. Gardasil is against 16 and 18, as well as against the 2 strains that cause the vast majority of genital warts. So, couple of shots, not super comfortable, but is going to massively decrease your risk of certain cancers, usually cervical, penile, anal, and throat, and also reduce your risk of getting warts. It's a pretty good trade-off, right? The recommendation at the moment is that all children be vaccinated around age 11 or 12 because their immune systems are well developed and this is the point where they're not yet old enough that they're probably having any sort of sexual contact, but they are old enough that the vaccine will be relatively fresh, their antibody titers will be relatively high at a point when they are starting to explore their sexuality. Anyone who's in the range of 13 to 26 who hasn't yet been vaccinated, it's strongly recommended they get up what's called catch-up vaccination. Why? Well, because you may have it already, but if you don't have it yet, we can still protect you. And hey, the vaccines are against 2 or 4 strains, so even if you've already contracted one of them, you may not have contracted all of them yet. While HPV is sort of the #1 virus that's associated with cancer, it's not the only one, and so it's likely in the future that more vaccines are going to be developed which will actually be able to reduce our cancer risk.